I walked into the boardroom that morning expecting a routine meeting, maybe a few updates on ongoing projects, but what I found instead felt like a punch straight to the chest. The room was buzzing with an uneasy energy, whispers darting between the executives as I stepped toward my seat. And then, without warning, he looked up from his desk. My husband, the man I had trusted, loved, and built a life with, and spoke words that cut deeper than anything I had ever imagined. "You're fired," he announced, loud enough for every eye to turn to me. The shock froze me in place, disbelief mingling with a rising tide of humiliation. I could feel the heat in my face, my heart hammering as colleagues tried to mask their reactions. How could he, my husband, stand there and pronounce this? I had dedicated years to the company, sacrificed nights, holidays, even weekends, never expecting betrayal from the person I loved most. My mind scrambled for logic, for some explanation, but there was none. The lies he accused me of, I knew them to be false, twisted versions of my integrity. I had trusted him implicitly, sharing both personal and professional vulnerabilities, and now all of it had been weaponized against me in front of everyone I knew. Each word echoed in my head, the sting of disbelief mixing with shame and heartbreak. I felt my stomach sink, my hands trembling, and an unfamiliar anger bubbling beneath the surface. How could he do this? And why, if not for some petty vindictive amusement? The whispers, the sideways glances, the barely contained smirks, all of it compounded my shock. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the words lodged in my throat. All I could do was watch as my reputation, my work, my life seemed to unravel in a single cruel moment. I couldn't believe he'd do this to me. And for what? In the quiet moments before that meeting, I began to replay the last few months in my mind, and suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. There had been small things. Offhand comments he made about my decisions that felt like teasing but carried a strange edge. Subtle digs about my performance in front of colleagues. Suggestions that maybe I wasn't as capable as everyone thought. At first I brushed them off, convinced I was overreacting or being too sensitive. Then there were the private conversations, where he would twist my words, reminding me of mistakes I didn't make, planting seeds of doubt in my mind until I questioned my own judgment. I remembered the time he praised a junior colleague for a task I had completed, framing it as if I hadn't been trying hard enough. I had laughed it off, wanting to believe it was harmless, but now I could see it as part of a pattern, a slow erosion of my confidence and credibility. Even small family gatherings had hints. Comments from distant relatives subtly implying I was reckless or undeserving, remarks he never corrected. I thought I had been imagining things, interpreting normal tension as something sinister. But the shock of the firing made it clear I hadn't. I had ignored the warning signs, blinded by trust and love, assuming he would never intentionally harm me. And yet, here I was, realizing that for months, my intuition had been quietly screaming at me, while I chose to silence it. The betrayal wasn't just this one moment. It had been building silently, patiently, until it erupted with devastating force. After the meeting, I wandered through the office like a ghost, every glance feeling like a verdict. Some colleagues avoided my eyes entirely, pretending nothing had happened, while a few whispered condolences that barely scratched the surface of what I was feeling. My inbox was a mixture of messages, some filled with support and disbelief, others laced with judgment or subtle skepticism. Even friends I had considered loyal seemed hesitant, unsure whether to side with me or him, and that uncertainty stung more than any accusation. The social fabric I had relied on began to fray as rumors swirled, each distorted version of the story making me feel smaller, more invisible. I felt the familiar ache of betrayal, now compounded by isolation, realizing that trust could be so easily weaponized. And yet, amid the swirl of doubt and judgment, a quiet ember began to glow within me. I remembered the countless nights I had poured myself into my work, the sacrifices I had made, the love I had invested. If they thought I would crumble, they were wrong. That ember, fragile yet persistent, began to kindle a sense of resolve. I couldn't let this define me. Not now, not ever. Somewhere beneath the humiliation and heartbreak, determination was taking root, whispering that the story wasn't over, and my part in it had only just begun. I spent the next few days in a haze, replaying every conversation, every interaction, every moment I had shared with him, trying to make sense of the chaos he had created. Slowly, the truth began to reveal itself in sharp, painful fragments. I realized the lies weren't random. They were carefully constructed, deliberate manipulations designed to isolate me, discredit me, and make my fall as public as possible. Colleagues who had once seemed friendly now appeared as pawns in his game, repeating the narratives he had seeded. Even family members, whom I had trusted implicitly, had been subtly swayed, primed to doubt my intentions without ever confronting him about the inconsistencies. My stomach churned as I understood the scope of his deception. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a misunderstanding. He had spent months orchestrating the perfect storm, knowing exactly which buttons to press to make me crumble. But with every detail I uncovered, I felt a shift within myself. Where there had once been shock and naive trust, there was now clarity and focus. I was no longer the unsuspecting wife. I was becoming the observer, the strategist, the one who finally saw the game for what it was. Power, subtle but undeniable, began to pulse through me. I could feel the weight of knowledge settling in my chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration, because now I knew I could act with precision. He had underestimated me, and that mistake was about to become the first step in turning the tide. I was no longer naive, and for the first time since the firing, I felt a flicker of control, small but unmistakably mine. I locked myself in the apartment that evening, letting the silence swallow me while my mind raced through the endless humiliation I had endured. Anger surged, hot and raw, intertwining with a deep, aching hurt that made my chest tighten with every heartbeat. I replayed the meeting, his smirk, the disbelief etched across everyone else's faces, and I felt a low, simmering fire ignite inside me. No one knew the truth. I had been dismissed over lies, over twisted versions of reality, and it was time they all understood exactly who they had underestimated. I began to plot quietly, methodically, thinking of the resources I had always kept in reserve, contacts in the company, legal avenues, and my own skills that had been overlooked, dismissed or outright ignored. Every detail mattered. Every timing had to be precise. I imagined subtle maneuvers, emails, documents, whispered truths shared with the right people at the right time. Each scenario played out in my mind like a game, the pieces slowly falling into place. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that while they thought I was broken, they hadn't the faintest idea who they were messing with. The vulnerability that had once defined me was gone, replaced by a cold clarity and determination. This wasn't about anger alone. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen, restoring my dignity, and ensuring that the lies that had humiliated me would unravel in ways they could never anticipate. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, knowing that the balance was beginning to shift, and this time, I would be the one holding the power. I spent the next several days meticulously piecing everything together, turning my apartment into a quiet command center of truth and strategy. Every email, every note, every minor inconsistency became a potential key in unraveling the narrative he had carefully constructed. I reached out to colleagues I could trust, asking simple, seemingly casual questions that slowly confirmed the pattern I had begun to suspect. I kept my tone neutral, never revealing the fire beneath my calm exterior, letting their own words and admissions form the skeleton of proof I needed. I reviewed meetings we had attended together, replaying conversations in my head, marking discrepancies and contradictions, cataloging moments where his arrogance had blinded him to the truth. While he strutted through the office, oblivious to the storm quietly building, I smiled inwardly, imagining the eventual shock when his lies and manipulations were laid bare. Each piece of evidence felt like a puzzle falling into place, a quiet, methodical reclamation of power. There were late-night sessions where I cross-referenced legal guidelines, corporate policies, and even family documents, ensuring every angle was covered. The contrast between his careless confidence and my strategic patience sharpened the anticipation of what was to come. Karma, long delayed, was taking shape under my hands, and though he remained unaware, every file, every message, every carefully stored detail whispered a promise. The reckoning was coming, and this time it would be precise, undeniable, and utterly satisfying. Late one evening, I finally reached out to someone I could trust completely, a colleague who had always admired my work and understood the quiet sacrifices I had made. Over coffee in a small, dimly lit cafe, I laid everything bare. The humiliation, the lies, the orchestrated betrayal. My voice wavered at first, but as I spoke, I felt a weight lifting, a clarity forming in the midst of chaos. They listened without judgment, occasionally offering sharp insights that cut straight to the heart of the injustice, reminding me that what I had endured wasn't my fault. We spoke in hushed tones about the potential consequences, the paths I could take, and the careful strategy required to ensure that truth triumphed over manipulation. I admitted my fear of being discovered too soon, of some misstep exposing my plans before they were fully formed. The tension in that conversation was almost tangible, each of us aware of the stakes, each of us calculating the delicate dance of timing and trust. But for the first time in days, I felt seen, not just as a wronged employee, but as a human being whose pain and intelligence deserved acknowledgement. By the time we parted, I had a renewed sense of purpose, the flicker of determination from earlier now burning brighter, reinforced by guidance, insight, and a shared commitment to justice. As I returned to the office, I noticed the subtle shifts in the way people looked at me. Some avoided eye contact entirely, unsure whether to acknowledge my presence, while others whispered in hushed tones just loud enough for me to catch fragments of their conversations. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had spent so much energy controlling perceptions, crafting a story that painted me as reckless and undeserving. Yet now, the very social structures he relied on were showing cracks. I watched him move through the room with his usual confidence, oblivious to the fact that the whispers had begun to include my side of the story. Even the families of our colleagues, those social circles that had once reinforced his authority, were now questioning him in subtle ways I could detect. I started to see a pattern. The very class and status distinctions he had used to intimidate and manipulate were also vulnerabilities I could exploit. I carefully smiled, letting my calm demeanor do the work, while information gathered behind the scenes began to shift the perception of power. I realized that social reputation was not fixed. It could be challenged, flipped, and reclaimed. Slowly, deliberately, I began to move through these circles, planting small truths here, casual corrections there, enough to make people reconsider what they had assumed. The narrative was shifting, and though he remained unaware, the balance of power was beginning to tip. I felt a quiet satisfaction as I realized that perception, once a weapon against me, was now becoming my ally. It was during a mid-morning meeting, one that I had been dreading yet secretly anticipating, when the opportunity presented itself. He launched into a rehearsed explanation, full of charm and authority, detailing a project that he claimed had succeeded solely because of his leadership, ignoring my months of work, late nights, and strategic planning. I sat quietly at first, letting the arrogance wash over me, cataloging every exaggeration, every omission. Then, when the room was silent enough to make an impact, I spoke, carefully and measured, weaving in facts, timelines, and emails he had forgotten existed. I didn't raise my voice. I let the evidence do the talking, letting colleagues' expressions shift from confusion to astonishment as the truth unfolded in plain view. The room's energy changed instantly. I could see the subtle disbelief in his eyes as the web of lies he had spun began to unravel, thread by thread. This wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a shouting match. It was quiet, precise, and devastating in its effectiveness. For the first time since the firing, I felt a surge of empowerment, a thrill in reclaiming my dignity with strategy rather than emotion. And as he froze, realizing that his carefully curated narrative had been dismantled piece by piece, I allowed a small, victorious smile to cross my face. He didn't see this coming. That night, alone in my apartment, doubt crept in like an unwelcome shadow. The fire that had driven me moments ago now flickered under the weight of guilt and fear. Was I being too harsh? Could I really confront him in the way I planned, knowing how much it could ruin not just his reputation, but our shared history, however tainted? The questions twisted in my mind, and for the first time in days, I felt small again, vulnerable in ways I hadn't allowed myself to be since the firing. Memories of our past, both tender and complicated, mingled with the sting of betrayal, creating a heavy knot in my chest. I questioned whether my desire for vindication was worth the personal cost, and for a fleeting moment considered retreating, pretending the humiliation had broken me. But beneath the guilt, a quieter voice whispered, one I had been listening to all along, the voice reminding me that strength was not the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it. My reflection lingered on every injustice, every subtle manipulation, every lie he had told, and slowly, determination began to reassert itself. The suspense of what was to come hung in the air, thick and electric, and I knew that when I moved next, it had to be decisive, calculated, and final. The day arrived with a quiet tension that felt heavier than anything I had experienced since the firing. I walked into his office, calm and composed, holding a thick envelope in my hand. He looked up from his desk with that familiar, overconfident smirk, the one that had once made my heart race, but now only fueled my resolve. "I assume you know why I'm here," I said, my voice steady, eyes locked on his. He chuckled dismissively, clearly expecting a groveling apology or some meek explanation, but I remained unshaken. With deliberate care, I set the envelope on his desk. "These are the divorce papers," I continued. "Everything I've endured, the lies, the manipulation, the humiliation, is documented, supported, and ready for court. And just so we're clear, your colleagues and family are all aware of the truth now." His face shifted from smugness to shock, a flicker of panic crossing his features as he realized the scope of what he had underestimated. You can't do this," he stammered, trying to regain composure, but I cut him off. "I already have. You've built your empire on arrogance and deceit, but the people around you now see it for what it is. The lies you spun, the manipulations, the favoritism, all of it has been exposed. And while you might try to spin your version of events, the documentation, the witnesses, and the strategy behind this move leave you no ground to stand on." He sank into his chair, speechless while I felt a surge of vindication wash through me. The humiliation that had been mine for so long was now reflected back onto him, and every ounce of anger, every tear, every sleepless night found release in this moment. I leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze directly. "You taught me one thing, whether intentionally or not," I said quietly. "Never underestimate the person you wrong. And now, the consequences of your actions are finally in your hands." Silence filled the room, broken only by the soft shuffling of papers and his shallow breathing. I left him there, stunned, powerless and exposed, the reversal complete. As I walked away, a mixture of triumph, relief, and an almost dizzying satisfaction pulsed through me. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming everything he had tried to take. My dignity, my reputation, and my sense of self. Within days, the ripple effects of my actions began to surface in ways I had only anticipated in my most calculated plans. Colleagues who had once whispered behind my back now approached me with quiet respect, acknowledging the truth that had been obscured for too long. Social media, ever hungry for drama, caught wind of the divorce papers and the documented lies, and the story spread faster than I could have imagined. Friends and acquaintances shared their shock, and even distant colleagues began questioning his behavior and motives. Meanwhile, he moved through these circles with the same arrogance that had always defined him, unaware that his reputation was crumbling with every passing conversation. The contrast was striking. His overconfidence and dismissive smirks only highlighted the precision and composure with which I had executed my plan. Karma, long delayed, was unfolding spectacularly, and for the first time in weeks I felt a deep, unshakable satisfaction. The same social and professional arenas that had once seemed hostile now reflected my triumph, my quiet dignity standing in sharp relief against his exposed deceit. People began to see him not as the commanding CEO or charming husband he had always presented, but as a man undone by his own arrogance, while I moved forward with poise, intelligence, and an unspoken authority that no one could question. It was the vindication I had craved, the public acknowledgement of truth, the reversal of power, and the emotional justice that had been denied to me for far too long. Sitting alone that evening, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of everything I had endured slowly lift. The humiliation, the betrayal, the sleepless nights, they were still there in memory, but they no longer held power over me. I had reclaimed my dignity, not through vengeance alone, but through strategy, patience, and unwavering self-respect. The people who doubted me, the colleagues who whispered, even my husband, none of it could diminish the clarity I now possessed. I reflected on the lessons carved into me through pain. Trust must be earned. Intuition is a compass, and strength often comes from embracing your vulnerability before turning it into power. There was subtle redemption in knowing I had acted with integrity, exposing lies without stooping to cruelty, allowing justice to unfold naturally. A quiet pride settled over me, not the pride of conquest, but the pride of knowing I had survived, grown, and emerged stronger. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly free, empowered, and ready to step forward into a life defined not by others' betrayals, but by my own resilience and vision for the future. As I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, strange as it seemed. Gratitude for the pain that had forced me to see myself clearly, for the betrayals that revealed who I could truly rely on, and for the strength I never knew I possessed. The journey had been harsh, filled with moments of doubt, heartbreak, and fear, yet every step had shaped me into someone more resilient, more aware, and more capable of protecting her own worth. I thought of the people who had believed in me, even in small ways, and of the lessons I would carry forward. Trust wisely, stand firm, and never let anyone define your value. There was still a sting, a lingering ache from what was lost, but it existed alongside a burgeoning hope, a subtle promise of a future where I could embrace happiness and success on my own terms. Looking back, I realized that the most profound victory wasn't the exposure or the revenge. It was the discovery of myself, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I could survive, rise and move forward with grace. And as I took my first step into the unknown, I felt lighter, freer, and unexpectedly at peace, carrying the bittersweet mix of pain and triumph as a testament to the life I had reclaimed.